How's it going? Like Eric said, I'm going to be talking about ES classes and decorators. I gave this talk in New York and in here in Silicon Valley about 2 months ago now, and things have changed a lot since then, so it's just going to be a bit of an update. Cool, so we'll get right into it. But first, the obligatory little bit about me. Bay Area native. I was born and raised in the East Bay. I love backpacking and try to get up into the mountains at least once a year. And I've been working with Ember for 5 years, so basically my entire software development career. You may know me better as P. Zurak, or just Zurak, the P is silent, on GitHub, Slack, Twitter, and basically everywhere else on the internet. That's why I chose that name. And like Eric said, I work at Datapart in FinTech on the ICE team, which stands for Infrastructure, Components, and Ember, because we love our TLAs. And, of course, we're hiring. So talk to me after if you're interested. So I thought I'd start off by talking about what ES classes are, first off. If you work in JavaScript long enough, you're going to have to deal with prototypes at some point. But a lot of that stuff gets hidden away. Sorry, I'm just ruining things. Just hit the share button. No, I think that's, yeah. Sorry. But yeah, so you'll have to deal with prototypes eventually, but as Ember developers, we don't generally have to. Like, we have this very nice object model that we've used for a very long time that works really well and kind of abstracts all the details away from us. But eventually, you'll probably come across some code that looks a bit like this. I don't know about you, but whenever I see code like this, it takes me a while to start kind of following it and figure out what's going on. We have like an animal class. That's its constructor, which is kind of weird, right? We give it a prototype that gives it some methods. And then we have a dog, which we want to extend that animal class. To do that, we have to apply the constructor of the previous class inside of that constructor, and it's already getting really weird. So the ES class syntax shipped in ES6 or ES 2015, and it made all of this a lot simpler and a lot easier to follow. You can see very clearly we have our animal class. It has a constructor. It has some methods. And we have a dog. It extends that. You can call super. Everything just works. And it kind of looks similar to the Ember syntax that you're all probably familiar with. However, it's been out for a few years now, and we haven't adopted it yet. So why do we want to start moving towards this now? What makes it good now? After all, we have this pretty great syntax. Like I said, it does basically all of those things. And it even has features that the other one doesn't, like being able to declare properties right on the class. That's something that has not been doable in ES classes. Additionally, we built the entire framework on this model. It would take a while to refactor things, so it's going to be a big change. And other frameworks have tried to move to that syntax, and it hasn't gone well for them. They've seen a very noticeable decline in developer ergonomics. So why do we think we're ready now? The short answer is that there are a bunch of new features that are right around the corner. Class fields are coming, so that is going to bring them basically to the same level of usability as our current class syntax. And then on top of that, we're also getting private methods and fields. And that's huge. That's something that today you can't really do without like a lot of fiddling with a weak map and just a lot of JavaScript black magic. And then also decorators, which are going to make code a lot cleaner, easier to understand, and something that JavaScript developers have been looking forward to for quite some time. So this example is taken from the unified class proposal. And this is, on the left is an example of what a class looks like today. And on the right is an example of what it would look like with private fields marked with the hashtags, with decorators that do binding of functions, and with class fields. Much cleaner, much simpler, much easier to read. Beyond that, it's also about sharing conventions. I mean, we're a framework that has always been about convention over configuration, right? And really adopting a shared class model with the rest of the JavaScript community. That's like the ultimate convention. We get to share tooling. We get to share editors with the rest of the massive ecosystem. We get to share education. Imagine never having to explain how the Ember object model works to a new developer. They just know because that's the standard. And we get to share code even via decorators. Things like that bound or auto-bind decorator. Even I could see a world where a computed property system is abstracted and no longer just a part of Ember. It could be applied to any class in any framework. So when I realized how much potential this had, I started looking into what we would need to do to make ES classes happen today. And the result of that research was the ES Class RFC, which was merged back in August. Of course, it takes a village to write an RFC, especially in the Ember community. So I'd like to thank Rob Jackson for helping me out with that and Chris Thoburn for getting me started down that path in the first place. And quick note before we go any further, all of this is still fairly experimental. Class fields are stage 3, decorators are stage 2. So they can change in the future. And if you start writing code on it now, your mileage may vary. So without further ado, let's dive in. So the first thing you would want to do is install the Ember decorators library itself. Whether or not you're going to be using the decorators, it also adds the class fields and decorators transforms. If you just want the transforms, however, we recently extracted them into a separate add-on that is just that, thanks to Bushtones. So you can just install that and get those transforms. Without class fields or decorators, I really don't recommend using ES classes. They're not ready yet. And here is a minimal example of using a class with ES classes. On the left, we have the Ember object model. On the right, we have ES classes. Not many differences. The class gets a name at the top, which is kind of nice. We have something we can search for, something that gets applied to the prototype, so we can actually see when we're logging what it is. That's a reason why you should always use a name, by the way, and not export an anonymous class, which you can technically do. We use the constructor function instead of init, and we use the super keyword instead of calling underscore super. And there's fewer commas and parentheses. Other than that, not much different. The main difference is actually in class fields. These are fundamentally different, and honestly, this is the part that tripped me up the most as I was learning how to use these. Especially as a seasoned Ember developer, you may have trouble with them. So, for instance, this is an example that demonstrates some of the differences. On the left, we have a very simple class. It defines a property, a field. And then we create an instance of the class, and we pass in the same property to override it. When we log it, we get that value. We know what's going on, exactly as we expected. With ES classes, we try to do the same thing, but it doesn't work. The reason for this is because essentially it desugars down to this. First, in the constructor, we make a call to super. That's where the property that you passed in gets set on the instance of the class. After that, the field that was defined on the class gets set. And it has to do this because those are the rules of constructors. You have to call super before you can interact with the instance in any way. This has a lot of advantages. One of the biggest gotchas when working with the class model in Ember today is that you will often accidentally share a value between every single instance of a class, like an array or an object. And then you have to wrap that in and compute it or something, right? It also just works like ES classes do today. It's basically like if you took a statement that was in the constructor, put it into the class body. So it's much more natural coming from the ES class world, but it doesn't play super nicely with our create, object.create, or by extension, the way that components will override values when they're passed in. And it can also have performance implications. You're creating a new array or a new object per instance of your class, so you do have to be aware of that. There are a couple ways around this if you want to set a default value and be able to overwrite it. One way is to just do it in the constructor. But you can also pass an expression to a class field, and that gets evaluated every single time the class is instantiated. So you can actually access this in that statement, and you can check to see if the field has been defined. There's another way, which is through the argument library that Ember Decorators has been working on as an organization separately from the main project. And I'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, let's dive into the decorators. These aren't official Ember API, and eventually that will probably land in an RFC at some point, but for now, this is more of an experimental project to figure out what the decorators API should look like. The API is stable, so we expect to keep it going and keep it supported long past the official API whenever that does come. And think of it like the Ember native DOM helpers project, which is now being accepted into the actual Ember test helpers via the recent RFC. Okay, so decorators themselves. The first one we have is the computed decorator. You can use that to just mark a getter or a setter function directly as a computed. As you can see, it's a bit cleaner, easier to understand what's going on. You can also mark a computed as read-only directly using the read-only decorator. And yeah, we are using setter and getter functions. You can use computed on a normal function right now, but that's something we've deprecated in favor of this style and will be removing for the next version of Ember decorators. You can also use all the computed macros except for read-only because it would have conflicted with the other read-only. The solution there is to do at read-only at alias, and it's basically the same thing. Maybe a little bit clearer what's going on too. Another set of decorators was created for customizing the element of your component. You may be familiar with tag name, class names, class name bindings, attribute bindings. All of these things are going to be going away at some point in the future with Glimmer components, hopefully, but for now, we have to use them. So tag name and class names are both class decorators. And you can actually use the class name and attribute decorators directly on the properties that you want bound. So you no longer have to declare them in two places. It's much cleaner this way. There are decorators for injections. You can mark a property as a service or as a controller if you want to inject it. Basically the same. And there are also decorators for observers and event listeners. However, they are broken right now. This is something that the RFC specified should be fixed, and in the future it will be. But for now, you can't use them, and considering they are not considered best practice, it's probably best that way. Lastly, we also have an action decorator. So you can use this to mark a function as an action, as opposed to before where you would pass the actions in on the actions hash. One thing to note about this is that function now exists both on the class itself and on the internal actions hash. So we had one bug where somebody made a clicked action or click action, and it conflicted with the event handler click function. So you got to be wary of those name collisions. But other than that, it's much nicer to be able to kind of read over that. And you can check out the rest of the API documentation online. It's all generated using ESDoc. So yeah, cool. So argument decorators. The argument decorators library is a separate library, and it has two main goals. One was to provide a very simple, sane way to set default values, kind of make it more like the original syntax. And the other was to provide some runtime checking, or runtime type checking and validations, similar to the Ember prop types library. You can see here the argument decorator in action. You just mark a class field as an argument. If you use the component without passing in a value, it uses the default. If you pass in a value, it'll be overridden. And if you try to use an argument on that component which has not been declared as an argument, it will actually throw an error. This way, you enforce that people actually declare their arguments ahead of time. And here you can see the type decorator, as well as the required and immutable decorators, which allow you to specify at runtime validations that should happen on all these fields. The type system is basically, it's based on TypeScript, so it's basically the same thing. All of these get stripped in production builds, so it should have no performance implications on your apps. And at this point, you might be wondering, okay, why should I use this over TypeScript? Part of it's because incremental adoption, being able to adopt a TypeScript in a large app, it might take some time. Another part is for add-on developers. You can actually enforce that your users use the correct types, even if they're running in JavaScript. So this does provide advantages there. And TypeScript isn't for everyone, so this is an alternative. Okay, so what are some of the remaining caveats of using classes today? First off, extending is currently broken in the sense that once you start using classes to extend Ember classes, you can't go back. It's only ES classes from that point on. That's eventually going to be fixed per the RFC, but and this is what it will look like when it is fixed. So you'll be able to have a foo component, extend it using a class, and extend that class back using .extends. But for now, that does not work at all. So if you're going to adopt it, you're going to have to go all in, or at least from that point down in the class subtree. Also, the RFC took the position of not providing any mixin support. And really, there were two reasons for this. One is because mixins are a very generic concept. Other libraries actually already exist for them with decorators and everything. And because we're no longer going to be using a Ember-specific class model, it didn't really make sense to create an Ember-specific mixin model. And the other reason was to leave room should the spec decide to add something like mixins or traits in the future. You can still use them if you really need to. You can use them with the .extend syntax, and once extending both ways is fixed, you'll be able to do that at any point in the chain. So they're not gone, but they won't be supported using the new syntax. Finally, for legacy usage, if you're using any version before Ember 2.13, you'll notice that basically everything that I showed you tonight doesn't really work, or large parts of it. This is because of the double extend Ember used to use to inject things like services into components and classes. You can actually fix this really easily by installing the Ember legacy class transform. All this does is convert the constructor function of the class into the init function. The constructor function is actually what breaks. Class fields break, a whole bunch of other things break because of that. The init function still works, luckily. So, and because they're run in basically identical code paths, there are basically no differences. So everything should just work. All right, so what's next for decorators and classes? For Ember decorators, we're going to be breaking out the individual packages or different parts into individual packages and add-ons, so you can just pick and choose which ones of those decorators you actually want. We're also going to be updating to the next version of the class fields and decorators specs. We're actually using the stage 1 transforms still, because Babel hasn't implemented the stage 2 transforms or 3 transforms yet, and neither TypeScript refuses to implement them. Which brings me to my next point. We're going to be working on TypeScript compatibility as soon as decorators move to stage 3, and we can count on them to actually implement it. And then we're going to be working on some better tooling for the Ember community as a whole. One project I'm really excited about is being able to use that type information from Ember argument decorators to actually fully generate documentation for add-ons, including what arguments a component receives and what properties it receives and what actions it sends. So that would be pretty nice instead of having to use like JSDoc, at param, and all of that. Or at type, whatever. And then eventually first class support in Ember. At some point, I'll probably have an RFC to bring decorators into Ember. And when that happens, we'll keep the Ember Decorators project going for a while, maintain support, but slowly move people off of it. So takeaways. ES classes make Ember easier to learn. You don't have to learn a whole new object model. You don't have to learn a whole new syntax all up front. They allow us to share resources and tooling with a much larger community, and hopefully that will make things easier on us in the future. They bring us more in line with the future of JavaScript and TypeScript. They bring us new features like private fields, which are going to be great. And if you ask me, they just look better. If you want to try these out and need a reference guide, you can go to build.adapar.com. I released a blog post about all of this a little while back, and it kind of lays everything out much more explicitly. So, yeah, cool. That's everything. Any questions?
Silence. All right, well, let's give a round of applause.